Audiobook Academy Biography presents Frank Lucas. Gangster and drug lord Frank Lucas had built an international network of drug traffickers by the 1960s, stretching from New York to Southeast Asia. A native of North Carolina, Frank Lucas began his criminal career in New York City's Harlem neighborhood in 1946. With his multinational drug empire stretching from New York to Southeast Asia by the 1960s, he was one of the most powerful men on the planet. Extortion and corruption were his main weapons of choice. When he was arrested in 1975, Lucas had millions of dollars in cash and property spread throughout multiple locations. Childhood. Frank Lucas, a country lad from Greensboro, was born on September 9, 1930, in LaGrange, North Carolina. Frank Lucas's life story is one of mystery, reality, and legend, much of which Lucas himself has helped to perpetuate. Rural North Carolina was a tough place to grow up during the Great Depression. African Americans, more than any other group, were disproportionately affected by poverty in the rural South during this time period. Taking care of his younger siblings was a big part of Lucas' childhood, and he got into plenty of mischief along the way. He claims that witnessing the murder of his cousin was the igniting event in his criminal career. In the cabin where he was staying, he was just 6 years old when 5 members of the Ku Klux Klan, hooded and covered in sheets, arrived one night. Lucas' 13-year-old cousin was shot and killed by the assailants who said he had flirted with a white woman. However, investigators have never found evidence to back up Frank Lucas' assertion, as has been the case with much of the legend around him. Lucas, the family's eldest son, was responsible for devising strategies to keep the household afloat. During the Great Depression, finding a work was nearly impossible, so he turned to food theft. In time, as he grew stronger and more experienced, it became more profitable for him to mug drunken patrons outside the neighborhood tavern. During his late teens, he was employed as a truck driver for a pipe firm until he was caught in bed with the boss's daughter. Lucas' father was knocked out cold after a battle ensued in which Lucas used a pipe to hit him in the head. Before setting the business on fire, he robbed it of $400. Fearing for his safety, his mother pleaded with him to seek asylum in New York. Moving to New York City is the best option. In the summer of 1946, Lucas landed in Harlem. People advised him to use his intellect and work his way up to being an elevator operator or a hotel doorman. Although illegal gambling and drug sales were lucrative, Lucas was able to see how the real money was made. He grew bolder and more brutal with each subsequent crime. At gunpoint, he robbed a nearby tavern. He then broke a guard's jaw with a slug from his brass knuckles while stealing a tray of diamonds from a jewelry store. He boldly broke into a high-stakes crap game at a nearby club and robbed all of the players, believing he had the upper hand. On a crowded sidewalk in the summer of 1966, Lucas shot a neighborhood criminal who had broken a dope transaction. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, a longtime Harlem gangster who ran gambling and extortion operations, was impressed by his efforts. However, Frank Lucas took Johnson's lessons to the next level, creating one of the most wealthy criminal enterprises of the 20th century. The sovereignty of Harlem was left up for grabs after Johnson's death in 1968. Lucas pounced on the opportunity to expand his reach and acquire as much land as he could. Contraband drugs on a global scale. Frank Lucas aspired to be Donald Trump rich, as he put it. His confidence in his ability to succeed in the narcotics industry was matched by his knowledge of how to go about it. He began by drawing up a plan. Backtracking was the term he used to describe it. For a month or two at a stretch, he'd lock himself in a hotel room with no access to the outside world. He'd reflect on all he'd done in the past and what he learned from them. Then he'd go ahead to the future, going over every stage of the operation in his mind, including the smallest of details and the most minute of minutiae. For Frank Lucas, taking over Johnson's operation meant breaking the Italian mafia's monopoly. Harlem's mafia's heroin trade was the primary target of his plan to go to the source. For some years, the Vietnam War had been going on. Among the various illegal narcotics to which U.S. service members had been exposed was heroin. In the United States, they sought out new sources of their addictions once they returned home. Dope was widely available in major American cities by the late 1960s and early 1970s, with brand names like Mean Machine, Can't Get Enough of That Funky Stuff, and Harlem Hijack among the most popular. In order to meet this demand and make a sizable profit, Lucas understood he would need to obtain the medication straight from the manufacturer. As a result, he made plans to visit Southeast Asia, having Leslie Ike Atkinson as a partner. The expectation of invincibility is a term coined by Frank Lucas. He didn't give a second thought to jumping on a plane and flying halfway across the world to Thailand on his own. When he arrived, he had no knowledge of the country or the language. In spite of this, He was involved in one of the deadliest professions imaginable, international narcotics trafficking. Lucas stayed at the Dusit Thani Hotel during his arrival in Bangkok in 1968. At Jack's American Bar, a popular hangout for African American soldiers, he met Leslie Ike Atkinson, a fellow soldier and a friend of his. Many U.S. Army soldiers in Southeast Asia relied on Atkinson to supply them with narcotics on a regular basis. A Greensboro native like Lucas, Atkinson was married to a distant relative of Lucas. As a result, Lucas instituted a hiring strategy restricting positions to family members and close friends. He accepted Atkinson's offer to furnish the heroin, but Lucas insisted on seeing the activities himself. Atkinson's primary business partner, a Chinese Thai man named Luechi Ruby Watt, was located after nearly 2 weeks of trekking through the jungles of Thailand. Poppy fields held by Ruby Watt, also known as 007, were located in the Golden Triangle, a deep jungle area bordering Thailand, Burma, and Laos. To make heroin, the poppies were processed in mountain caves that had been dug into the mountainsides near the crops. At $4,200 a unit, Lucas purchased 132 kilos of high-quality heroin on his first trip. A kilo from the mafia would have set him back $50,000 in Harlem. In order to establish up a global distribution network, Lucas and Atkinson assembled a military inside the military comprised of draftees and enlisted personnel. High-ranking officers, both American and South Vietnamese, had to be purchased into the system. To assemble his crew, Lucas utilized a combination of charm and expensive bribes. Lucas personally oversaw the operations in Southeast Asia, as he did in practically every aspect of his business, occasionally posing as an army general. The objective was to fly heroin shipments to military bases on the East Coast via military jets. An accomplice would then open the parcels and make them available for sale. According to the report, a large portion of the dope was either placed into the coffins or cadavers of deceased soldiers. According to Lucas' testimony, he hired a carpenter from North Carolina and flew him to Bangkok to build over 24 government-issued coffins with false bottoms, large enough to load 6 to 8 kilograms of heroin inside. A report claims that Atkinson merely hid the heroin in pieces of furniture. Frank Lucas Brothers, the Country Boys. Frank Lucas used a combination of toughness and intelligence when he returned to the United States to set up a new firm. Only well-known North Carolina relatives and acquaintances, such as Leslie Atkinson, worked on his projects. To him, the city's temptations were less likely to entice them into stealing from him. They all came to New York with him, all 6 of them. They were known as the Country Boys in New York City, and they dominated the area between 7th and 8th Avenues in Harlem known as 116th Street. As with any entrepreneur, Lucas went about selling his product by providing good value at a fair price. Due to the purity of his heroin supply, he could cut the drug at a far higher percentage, usually between 10 and 12%, than most street heroin, which typically contained between 5 and 6%. Lucas engaged a group of young ladies to combine the heroin with manite and quinine that he had bought from China. These women wore nothing but plastic gloves in order to deter robbery. In order to secure his investment, Lucas used harsh violence against everyone who stood in his way, striking terror in his opponents and inspiring admiration from friends and business partners. To live in the lap of luxury. Stash millions of dollars in the Caymans. The money started flowing in just as Lucas had hoped it would. $1 million a day is what he claimed to be making every day. Due to lack of storage space, he would launder the money by personally transporting big bundles of bills to a bank in the Bronx, where bank employees would sort through them and swap the fake bills with actual ones that were in circulation at the time. A total of 200 Bank Secrecy Act offenses were later pleaded guilty by bank executives. Heroin was worth $300,000 a kilogram at the peak of his career, and he had $52 million stashed away in various Cayman Islands banks at the time. Lucas purchased legitimate businesses, such as a chain of dry cleaners and gas stations, in order to hide the money he exchanged. There were also several thousand acres of Black Angus cattle and prize breeding bulls on his North Carolina ranch, which was called Paradise Valley, owned by him and his wife. Celebrity's friend. As a New York celebrity, Lucas made the rounds. He was a regular at some of New York City's most popular nightclubs, where he would mingle with the likes of Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, and James Brown. Lucas was supposed to star in The Rip-Off, a Hollywood gangster film set in New York City's street. He invested roughly $100,000 towards the film and provided the producers with 6 of his high-end autos, which were used in the filming. In spite of this, the film was never completed. A pair of $140,000 Van Cleef bracelets for he and his wife, Julie, were among the many extravagant purchases he'd made. It cost her $50,000 for the coat and $10,000 for the hat to go with it. As a result, Lucas chose to dress informally most of the time in order to avoid drawing notice. In whom did Frank Lucas look up to? Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, a Harlem gangster, served as Lucas' tutor. The degree to which Lucas and Johnson were close is a matter of debate. Bumpy's right-hand guy, Lucas claims Johnson took him under his wing and mentored him. Some of Johnson's closest associates, such as his wife Mame, have testified that Johnson disliked Lucas and never elevated him above the status of an underling in his command. Trial. Corruption in the law enforcement community in Harlem is akin to Frank Lucas being unable to sell heroin on the streets of Southeast Asia due to his reliance on corrupt military personnel. Special Investigations Unit, SIU, officers in New York City in the 1960s and 1970s were utterly corrupt. It possessed jurisdiction over the entire city and practically unrestricted power. A cowboy culture had taken hold, with members of the unit breaking into homes without a warrant to hunt for suspected drug dealers, installing illegal wiretaps, bribing informants, and providing them with heroin to keep them in line. In order to look the other way, several police personnel were on the take from drug dealers in the area. Several kilograms of heroin and cocaine were found in the trunk of Frank Lucas's car by the head of the SIU, Bob Lucy. His release from police custody required an exchange of $30,000 in exchange for 2 keys of heroin, according to Lucas. Many New York City police officers were involved in the crimes they were supposed to be stopping as a result of this practice. Richard "Richie" Roberts as the prosecutor. The Justice Department became concerned about police corruption after it became public knowledge. The Special Narcotics Task Force, SNTF, was established in 1971 by Essex County, New Jersey officials under the leadership of Assistant Prosecutor Richard "Richie" Roberts. Essex County Detective Roberts, a former U.S. Marine and recent Seton Hall University Law School graduate, has been on the job since 1963. He had a reputation as a hard-working cop who did what he had to in order to complete his mission. As a New York City police officer, Roberts was untainted by corruption. House raid. A DEA strike group conducted a surprise raid on the Teaneck, New Jersey, home of Frank Lucas on January 28, 1975, following an extensive SNTF investigation. Julie, Lucas' wife, hurled 3 suitcases full of cash out the window in a fit of fear. A total of $584,000 in street money was retrieved throughout the process. Some Cayman Islands safe deposit boxes, keys, property deeds, and a Honduran ambassador's ball ticket were also discovered. 10 people were taken into custody quickly, but Frank Lucas was not one of them. A direct link between Lucas and the drug smuggling has not yet been established. After that, there was a short respite. Lucas' nephew, a member of the Country Boys, broke down during questioning. Names were given, locations were shown, and public pay phones were identified as being utilized to conduct narcotics raids. Many of Lucas' relatives were charged with drug trafficking as a result of the evidence gathered by Assistant District Attorney Roberts. The evidence against Lucas was thin, but Roberts managed to gather enough evidence from the co-defendants to get the case to trial. Heroin, notably Lucas' Blue Magic brand, which was significantly more potent than ordinary heroin, was the subject of numerous testimonies at the trial. Blue Magic sales killed more black people than the KKK, according to Roberts, who argued against Lucas in court. Lucas was found guilty and sentenced to 70 years in jail by the jury. He became an informant after only a few months, handing over the names of mafia operatives and corrupt cops in New York City. He even gave up Atkinson, the Thai heroin kingpin he'd been working with for years. 150 multi-defendant cases, including 3/4 of New York's Drug Enforcement Agency and 30 members of Lucas' family, came from Lucas' testimony. The ending in the film. Lucas' sentence was lowered to 15 years as a reward for his information, and he was released in 1981. To make matters worse, an additional arrest was made for him in 1984 for trying to buy 1 kilogram of cocaine with an ounce of heroin and $13,000 in cash. Richie Roberts, who had started his own practice as a defense lawyer by this point, called Lucas after learning of the arrest of his former adversary. The second trial, despite the fact that Lucas had previously issued a $100,000 contract on Roberts' life, was willing to defend Lucas. For a man who had been convicted twice for the same crime, Lucas earned a reduced sentence of 7 years in large part thanks to Roberts' efforts. Once out of prison, Roberts contacted Lucas and promised to help him get his life back on track, this time after he had been released from prison in 1991. During the post-trial probe, Lucas and Roberts had grown distant. As Roberts began to believe Lucas was truly sorry for his actions, their bond grew stronger. Roberts became Lucas' godfather as a result. After being released from prison for the final time, Lucas went to Harlem to see the devastation wreaked by his drug enterprise. At this point, he began to see the extent to which his business had harmed individuals and the community as a whole. Afterward, Lucas expressed his regrets, stating, "A lot of bad things happened to me. I'm very sorry for what I've done to you both. I am, in fact." Due to the harm created by his actions, he has spent most of his remaining time working to fix it. A non-profit organization run by his daughter provides a safe sanctuary for children of incarcerated parents. Yellow Brick Roads. With the release of the film American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington, in 2007, Hollywood once again paid a visit to Lucas' family. In Juliana Ferre, Lucas' wife, a former Puerto Rican homecoming queen, he married. A 5-year sentence for her involvement in her husband's illegal narcotics operation. After Ferre was released from prison, the pair split up for several years until reuniting in 2006. Once again, she was detained in her native Puerto Rico for attempting to distribute cocaine. She received a 5-year sentence. Frankina Lucas Sinclair is one of Lucas' 7 children, and she founded the program Yellow Brick Roads, a safe refuge for youngsters whose parents are in prison. Death. On May 30, 2019, Lucas died of natural causes in a New Jersey care facility. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.